Well, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I'm Alexander Downer. I'm the chairman of the Royal Overseas League, and I want to welcome you this evening to the latest in our public affairs evenings. And the guest we have with us this evening is Lord George Robertson, who is most famous for having been the Secretary General of NATO, particularly during the 9/11 catastrophe and the response to 9/11, which led to the war in Afghanistan and, of course, Iraq as well. But he, before he became the Secretary General of NATO, was the the Defence Secretary, Secretary of State for Defence, and he was the first Secretary of State for Defence of the Blair government after the 1997 election. He was a Scottish Labour MP, something that's fairly rare nowadays. Is there only one of them, I think, from memory? There are not many. Not too many more Tory MPs from Scotland either. But nevertheless, he was for some years, quite some years, a Scottish Labour MP. He's going to talk to us tonight for about 10, 15, 20 minutes, and then I'll raise some issues with him, as is our normal format, for 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll throw the floor open to questions and answers. Just to touch on the protocol here, the speech is not just live for all of you to hear, but is also being broadcast through the Royal Overseas League network. The Q&A session, which will be particularly interesting, I think, the Q&A session, however, must operate under Chatham House rules. That means that you can quote what is said, but you cannot quote who said it. I mean, you can quote anything I say, unless it's a gaffe, in which case it would be great if you could perhaps forget it. Unfortunately, history mainly doesn't if you make a gaffe. It's just about the only thing they ever remember about you. Seriously, and do respect Lord Robertson. If we don't apply these rules and stick by the rules, well, we're not going to get much out of our speakers, because it always is difficult for them, given the nature of the media here and, well, the media anywhere for that matter. The last thing I want to say before I ask Lord Robertson to take the microphone is to remind you that on the 15th of September, we have Professor Andrew Roberts, who is arguably Britain's greatest historian. That's a subject, I guess, for debate. One of, for sure, the greatest historians of this country in this era. And he's going to give our annual lecture, in particular about the founder of ROSL, Lord Northcliffe, and Evelyn Wrench. So I think that will be an especially interesting evening. But with those few words, it's with great pleasure that I introduce George Robertson to take the stage and speak to you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexander, for that kind introduction. I remember meeting another foreign minister turned Australian diplomat, Gareth Evans, who was to prove to me that an Australian diplomat was a contradiction in terms. So anyway, it's good that you're here in your capacity in the Royal Overseas League, and I'm really pleased to be with you here this evening. And I see another former alumni of the Ministry of Defence sitting in the front row here as well, so he'll be highly critical later on, no doubt. I want to just really give you some thoughts on what's going on in the world today. I'll not focus on what's going on in our country today. I'm afraid that would be even beyond my capacity for fiction writing. But the world is complex, it's unpredictable, it's highly unstable. And I want to talk to you first about a few words about Ukraine, because it is and needs to be at the very top of our agenda today. Secondly, I'd like to say a few words about NATO as an institution, and then to talk about the challenges that we face in what is now known as the Global South. So first of all, Ukraine. What's happening in Ukraine today is not just an outrage to international order, not simply the case of a superpower with nuclear weapons, a member of the Security Council of the United Nations, breaking the Charter of the United Nations, and the Helsinki Accords, the Budapest Memorandum, the NATO-Russia Founding Act, the Rome Declaration, cavalierly trying to actually extinguish a nation state. Now, that in itself is pretty outrageous and must be defended, and we must reverse it. But at the same time, it represents something actually much more fundamental to all of us. It is in many ways an existential risk to our way of life as well. Since the end of the Second World War, and indeed since the end of the Cold War, we have become used, maybe even complacent, about the international order and its stability and predictability. We've grown used to the liberal international order of democracies, of human rights, of the rule of law, rights of private property, the distinction between religion and the state. And here we have it being challenged in a major and substantial way, right in the heart of our own continent. And therefore, what President Zelensky and his people are doing is about our defense as well as about their defense. It's about protecting them from the overwhelming force that Russia is directing at them at the moment, but also it is about what would happen if President Putin succeeds. Not just in unraveling that order, but where he goes after that if he is seen to be successful. 20 years ago, almost at this time, on the 28th of May 2002, I stood on a rostrum very much like this, with Vladimir Putin standing at a rostrum right beside me. And I heard him saying these precise words: Ukraine is an independent, sovereign nation state, and it will choose its own path to peace and security. His words. Not written down, but in answer to a question at that time. And that was only about an hour after he'd signed the Rome Declaration that day at the NATO-Russia summit. And the Rome Declaration said that NATO and Russia would base their relations on a shared commitment to, I quote, respect for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of all states, and their inherent right to choose the means to ensure their own security. And now this same man, in the same position of President of Russia, is now trying to extinguish a neighbouring individual nation state and its right not only to its name, but even to its own existence as well. And therefore, we've got to make sure, all of us, that we support the Ukrainians in what they're doing. It's already been seen that the Russians were not the 10-foot tall warriors that we thought they were. And their capacity for violence has been shown up in terms of their withdrawal from Kiev and their assumption that they would be greeted with flowers and would be able to decapitate the Zelensky government and run the whole of the country from there. We've seen the shambles that their military has represented, but they've still got more ammunition and much more that they can and they will throw at the Ukrainians in order to gain those parts of Ukraine that they desperately want, and to go way beyond that if they can possibly do it as well. And therefore, it is absolutely essential that we pay the price. And it will be a substantial price in order that they get the equipment, they get the training, they get the backup, and they get the political support that will allow them to roll back the Russians from their objectives as well. So it's not simply the British government view, not even the official opposition view. It should be the British view. We're fighting and we are sacrificing in order to protect our own way of life, which is at risk if Vladimir Putin in any way achieves the objectives that he has set out in relation to his next door neighbour. So my second subject is to talk about NATO, and it's intimately related, of course, to what is happening in Ukraine. President Vladimir Putin, having seen the shambles that was the withdrawal of NATO troops from Afghanistan, clearly felt that there was a substantial advantage to be gained. America withdrawing in that remarkable and incoherent way gave a signal of an unwillingness by America to face up to its global responsibilities. And he perhaps thought, hidden away in his dacha and hiding from the virus, that here was the opportunity that he could take. He thought that he could stop the enlargement of NATO. In fact, NATO has now taken in Finland and Sweden. You know, I've said to people, I tried for 4 years as Secretary General of NATO to persuade Finland and Sweden to join NATO. Vladimir Putin managed to do it in 4 weeks. So NATO is now bigger and stronger and much more effective than it has ever been in its history. He set out to break Europe. He thought Europe would be divided. And in fact, Europe has been more united and more decisive than it probably has been in many, many years. And he thought naively that he could break the United States from Europe after the Trump years. And in fact, the United States and Europe are closer now than they have been for many, many years as well. So these objectives have been cancelled out. But not only that, I believe very firmly that Vladimir Putin isn't worried about NATO. After all, he's taken away all of the NATO-facing troops and brought them down to the Donbass in Ukraine. So all of the formations that used to threaten Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania and Poland, all of those troops that were configured against the NATO countries somehow have vanished and have been redeployed in order to satisfy his fixation. My view is, very firmly, is that he worries about the European Union. And there indeed, he now finds that that objective has been frustrated by the decision to give Ukraine candidate status for European Union membership. Now, to those who say to me, well, no, it's really NATO and it's not the European Union that Vladimir Putin worries about, I say, well, look at how all of this started. In 2014, it was the offer by the European Union of an association agreement to the then President Yanukovych in Kiev, which actually sparked the decision by the Kremlin to tell him that they were to reject it. That led on to the Maidan Revolution, the overthrowing of Yanukovych, and the Orange Revolution at that time. Because the key thing here is that NATO doesn't change countries. I was able to persuade countries who were coming in to NATO, and I brought in 7 new countries into NATO to do various things about military compatibility and about human rights and democratic sustainability. But essentially a country that has 7,000 nuclear weapons is in itself not going to be frightened by NATO, a defence alliance anyway. And even in his heart of hearts, he knows, whatever his propaganda says, Putin knows that NATO is a defence alliance. But the European Union's effect is much more insidious and much more permanent. The European Union has changed countries fundamentally and permanently by the accession process of the European Union. Each chapter drives home an element of democratic scrutiny, of sustainability, of economic management, and of democracy in a way that no military alliance would ever actually be able to do. So the fourth part of his objective has already been frustrated by the decision to give European Union membership there as well. But NATO hasn't just enlarged, and remember, it's an enlargement, not an expansion. Every one of the countries joining NATO made an application to join, had to fulfill the conditions that were required. So it wasn't an expansion of the organization, it was a step-by-step enlargement. And indeed, at my second meeting with President Vladimir Putin, he said to me, when are you going to invite NATO to join, Russia to join NATO? And I said, Mr. President, we don't invite countries to join NATO, they apply to join NATO. To which he said, well, we're not going to stand in line with a bunch of countries that don't matter. And I said, well, we just stop the diplomatic sword dance, build a relationship, and see where it takes us. You know, so enlargement is one thing, but making sure that NATO retains credibility to defend its members is the other side of that coin. And therefore, when I went to NATO in October 1999, I said I have 3 priorities for NATO: capabilities, capabilities, capabilities. The strength of the alliance is built on its capabilities to defend its members. And Secretary General Stoltenberg has been outstanding in driving that message home. And Michael Fallon was Defence Secretary at the Wales Summit, wasn't it, where the capabilities were actually added to with readiness, because there's no point in having capabilities if they're not actually ready to go. And if you want to see what happens in the opposite situation, just look at what happened to the Russian army when it entered Ukraine today as well. So NATO is stronger, better, more resolute, more committed, more successful than it has ever been, thanks to President Vladimir Putin. And my third point, the final point I wanted to raise with you and leave with you, is my worry about the global south. The global south is not on our side. Bizarrely, the global south is either sitting on the fence or taking sides with Russia and China. And that really has to worry us considerably, because out of this conflict in Central Europe is going to come famine, it's going to come migration flows, the like of which we've not seen before, the accentuation of the climate emergency that will affect so many different countries, the disruption to supply chains that will affect their economies just as it's going to affect ours as well. So why should Latin America and the bulk of Asia, and especially Africa, not be worried about changing borders through the use of force? After all, Africa, after the years of colonialism, made a decision collectively that they would not change borders at all. Some of them are wholly artificial, some of them are arbitrary, some of them have the inherent conflict inside them, but they decided they would have to stick with the borders because otherwise everything would unravel. And yet we're now seeing in Europe the beginnings of the unraveling of borders through the use of force. So why don't those countries recognize their own stake here in what is happening in Ukraine? Well, first of all, they don't want to fall out with Russia and China, because while we were sleeping, the Belt and Road policy of China and the extensive diplomatic work of the Russian Federation has meant that a lot of these countries don't particularly want to fall out with countries that either are supplying them, like Russia, with arms, or supplying them with money and loans, like the Chinese, and therefore they're not willing to do that. Secondly, some of them bizarrely see it as a regional issue, something purely confined to Europe, and not a matter of fundamental principle of the changing of borders through the use of force. And thirdly, we are beginning to suffer now for the years of colonialism, the years of empire, the years of the domination by the superpowers. And therefore, Afghanistan, Iraq, and the rest of it all coming back to haunt us. And therefore, that massive diplomatic operation that is being undertaken by China and by Russia today to portray this as a battle between the West, the nasty, horrible American-controlled West, and of course the rest of the developing world, is beginning to have the traction that it should not have and does not deserve to have as well. So what do we do about it? That's the big question. Now, we fought the Cold War systematically, intelligently, imaginatively. We found ways of getting through and over the Iron Curtain in order to get our message through to the people who were enslaved in the communist countries. And I think we're going to have to energize ourselves now, re-energize ourselves to recognize that we need to win that battle of imagination. We need to win that battle of ideas. We need somehow to remind the rest of the world that their destiny is our destiny, that their destiny is dependent on what we are able to achieve at this point. And that's really why Ukraine matters, not simply to the Ukrainians. It matters to all of us in the world today. I'll leave it at that.